Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, reached critical acclaim and respect through abolitionist circles, and even overseas in England. However, Jacobs' book was never republished after the first edition and quickly faded from memory. By the beginning of the 20th century, Jacobs and her story had been all but forgotten. Jacobs' book was rediscovered in the mid-20th century during the Civil Rights Movement, but up until the 1980s, it was the commonly held academic opinion that Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was a fictional story written by an entirely different woman, Lydia Maria Child, another 19th century abolitionist. It wasn't until the 1980s that author and historian Jean Fagan Yellen found a variety of historical documents that not only proved that Harriet Jacobs was the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, but that it was an autobiography of her struggles and eventually her escape from the institution of slavery. Since then, the book, and even Jacobs herself as a historical figure, have seen a revival in popularity. For instance, in one of my favorite books, Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, Cora's story is inspired by much of what Harriet Jacobs went through. So what exactly is Harriet Jacobs' story? Luckily, we have a primary source to consult.
Harriet Jacobs was born in enslavement in Edenton, North Carolina on February 12, 1813. Jacobs' father, a skilled carpenter, was able to hire himself out for work, and she and her brother lived in a house with both of their enslaved parents. Because of this unusual situation, Jacobs was unaware of her enslaved status in the early years of her life. At 6 years old, following her mother's death, she was sent to live with her enslaver, Margaret Horniblow, and only then realized her status as an enslaved person. It was against the law to teach enslaved people to read or write. However, Horniblow felt sympathy towards Jacobs and taught her to read, write, and sew. When Horniblow died in 1825, the conditions of her will stipulated that Jacobs be left to her 3-year-old niece. Jacobs found herself at the mercy of the girl's parents, Dr. James and Mrs. Mary Norcom.
Dr. Norcom made aggressive overtures towards Jacobs, determined to force her into a sexual relationship, which only added to Mary Norcom's jealousy, creating a viciously toxic dynamic between the three. Hoping to be shielded from James Norcom's harassment, Jacobs began a relationship with a prominent white lawyer named Samuel Sawyer. Sawyer would later father Jacobs' only 2 children, Louisa Matilda and Joseph. However, Dr. Norcom's harassment persisted, this time focusing his efforts on her children. In 1835, Harriet Jacobs ran away to the home of her grandmother, a freed slave. For the next 7 years, she hid in a small crawl space beneath her grandmother's roof, barely able to move, spending her time reading, writing, and sewing.
In 1842, Jacobs received passage to Philadelphia, and then spent the next several years working in Boston and New York while she tried to free her children, Louisa and Joseph. They had been brought north but were still under the threat of repossession. Jacobs split her time between working for the family of Nathaniel Parker Willis, who is also buried at Mount Auburn, and working on behalf of the anti-slavery movement with her brother John in Rochester. After 10 years of living as a fugitive in the North, Jacobs' freedom, along with that of her children, was purchased by the Willis family.
Encouraged by her friend, a fellow abolitionist named Amy Post, Harriet Jacobs published Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861, just 2 months before the start of the Civil War. Now, Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl is considered an important primary source in the study of the institution of slavery, but it is also considered an early work of feminist literature, focusing on the sexual exploitation of enslaved women and white women's contribution to the evils of slavery.
During and immediately following the war, Jacobs and her daughter provided relief aid to freedmen and established schools and orphanages throughout the South. She moved to Cambridge in 1872 and ran a boarding house on Trowbridge Street before moving to the corner of Story Street and Mount Auburn Street, where she lived for 3 years. Her brother died in 1873 and was buried at Mount Auburn, and although Harriet and Louisa eventually moved to Washington, D.C., both were later buried at Mount Auburn as well.
Hi, I'm Corinne from Mount Auburn Cemetery. Thanks for watching our video. We're looking to put out more virtual content in the time of COVID-19 so that you can continue to learn about the cemetery along with us from the safety of your home. Thanks for watching, and be well.